My name is Amaka. You're welcome to Lizama's Stitches. Thanks for being here. If you're new here, you're welcome. Please click on the subscribe button and subscribe, and also turn on the notification bell so that whenever I upload new videos, you'll be notified. In this tutorial, we'll be learning how to make a princess dart bustier. So let's get started. This is my pattern paper, and I've drawn some lines already. So I'm going to tell you what I did. This is my starting point, which is also going to serve as my shoulder line. This is my bust point. This is my under bust point. This is my waist point, and this is my seam allowance. Now I'm going to label the lines. So this is my bust point. This is my under bust point. This is my waist point. And this is my seam allowance. From here, from the shoulder to the bust point is 10.5 inches. From the shoulder to the under bust point is 13.5 inches. Shoulder to waist point is 15.5 inches. And the seam allowance is 1 inch. Now I'm going to start by taking my shoulder measurement. Now the shoulder measurement I'm working with is 15 inches. 15 inches divided by 2 gives you 7.5 inches, plus ½ inch seam allowance gives you 8 inches. So I'm going to mark 8 inches here. Now I'm going to take my neck measurement. The neck width I'm working with is 4 inches. And the neck depth is 4.5 inches. So I'm going to connect it. I'll connect it with my French curve. From my shoulder line, I'm going to come down by 1 inch for my shoulder slope. I'm going to connect this point to this point to the neckline. The next thing I'm going to do is to impute my armhole measurement. The armhole measurement I'm working with is 18 inches. 18 divided by 2 gives you 9 inches. So this is my 9 inches. Now for me to be sure that this line is accurate, 8 inches. The 8 inches I have here, I'm bringing it down here. So I want to be sure that the line is accurate. So this is my 8 inches. I'm going to connect this point to this point. And I'll extend this point with an horizontal line. So this is my chest point. I'm going to label it chest point. So the next thing I'm going to do is to impute my dart line. So for me to get my dart line, I'm going to impute my bust span measurement. That is nipple to nipple measurement. The bust span measurement I'm working with is 8 inches. 8 divided by 2 gives you 4 inches, plus ½ inch seam allowance gives you 4.5 inches. So I'm going to mark 4.5 inches on this line, on my bust point, and on the seam allowance, and I'll connect it. Now on this point, on my waist point, I'm going to take 2 inches for my dart. Now this is how I'm going to distribute it. 2 inches, I'm going to distribute ½ inch here and 1.5 inch here. Now I'm going to mark ½ inch here and 1.5 inch here. I'm going to do the same thing on the seam on this point, ½ inch here and 1.5 inches. Half inch and 1.5 inches. On this point, that is my bust point, I'm going to come down by ½ inch. Now I'm going to connect this point to this point to this point, this point to this point to this point with my French curve. I'm going to connect this point to this point, and I'll connect this point to this point. I'm going to come up by ½ inch from this point. So I'm going to come back to this point. Now on this point, I'm going to take my bust measurement on my chest point. The bust circumference I'm working with is 38 inches. 38 divided by 4 gives you 9.5 inches. So I'm going to mark 9.5 inches on this line. That is on my chest point. This is my 9.5 inches. Now after that, I'm going to come back to this line. Now I'm going to find the midpoint of this line. Now this is the midpoint of this line. Now from this midpoint, I'm going to come in by 3/4 of an inch for my front armhole. Now I'm going to connect this point to this point and this point to this point with my armhole curve. Now I'll connect this point to this point. So this is my front armhole. Now the next thing I'm going to do is to find the midpoint of this line. Now I have 10 inches here. So the midpoint of this line is 5 inches. Now this is 5 inches. This is 5 inches. Now from this point, I'm going to come down by 1 inch. Now this is 1 inch. And I'm going to connect this point to this point and this point to this point. I'll connect this point to this point. So after that, I'm going to blend this point together. You know our bust is round, so I don't have pointy edges. I'm going to extend this line by 1 inch so I'll be able to create a new armhole line. So So this 1 inch I removed here, I'm replacing it here. I've just marked 1 inch. So I'm going to connect this point to this point. Now I'm going to come back to my chest point. The bust circumference I'm working with is 38 inches. 38 divided by 4 gives you 9.5 inches, which is this. Now 9.5 inches, I'm going to add 3 inches. Now I'm going to add my allowance on this paper. I like adding my allowance on my pattern paper so that when I'm cutting my fabric, it will be easy for me. But it's optional. You can decide to add your allowance on your pattern paper. You can also decide not to add and add on your fabric when you're cutting. But for this tutorial, I'm going to add my allowance on my pattern paper so that it will be easy for me to cut my fabric. So now this is my bust point. Now I'm adding 3 inches seam allowance, because this 1 inch I'm cutting off from here, I'm going to return it, plus 1 inch seam allowance, which I'm going to use to join it together, gives you 2 inches, plus 1 inch seam allowance, which I'm going to use to join the sides together, gives you 3 inches. It's better to have excess than to run short of fabric. If I have excess, I can easily trim it out after sewing. But when you run short of fabric, it means you have either spoilt your dress or a client's dress. So I'm going to use 3 inches seam allowance. So 9.5 inches plus 3 inches gives you 12.5 inches. Gives you 12.5 inches. So this is my 12.5 inches. Now I'm going to come down to my waist point. The waist circumference I'm working with is 31 inches. 31 inches divided by 4 gives you 7 3/4. 7 3/4 plus these 2 inches I'm going to remove from here. I'm removing 2 inches. I'm going to cut this off. These 2 inches I'm going to cut off from here. I'm going to return it here. So 7 3/4 plus 2 inches gives you 9 3/4, plus 2 inches seam allowance gives you 11 3/4. So I'm going to mark 11 3/4 here. The same measurement I have here, I'm going to bring it down to the seam allowance. Now on the seam allowance, I'm also marking 11 3/4. So I'll connect this point to this point. I'll connect this point to this point, and I'll connect this to this. Now after that, I'm going to add ½ inch seam allowance on the shoulder. So now I'm going to cut it. After cutting, this is what I'll have. Now this is my front panel. So I've drawn some lines already. Now this is my starting point, which is also going to serve as my shoulder line. This is my chest point. This is my waist point, and this is my seam allowance. The back panel has zipper allowance. Every measurement I'm taking is going to be this way. I'm going to take my measurement this way, away from the zipper allowance. Now I'm going to start by taking my shoulder measurement. The shoulder measurement I'm working with is 15 inches. 15 divided by 2 gives you 7.5 inches, plus half inch seam allowance gives you 8 inches. Now this is my 8 inches. Now I'm going to take my neck measurement. The neck width I'm working with is 4 inches, and the neck depth is 1 inch. So I'm going to connect it. Now from this point, from this shoulder point, I'm going to come down by 1 inch for my shoulder slant. Now this is my shoulder slant. I'm going to connect it to this point. Now this is my chest line. I'm going to connect this point to my chest line. Let me label these lines. Now this is my chest point, this is my waistline, waist point, and this is my seam allowance. Now I'm going to impute my dart. Now for me to impute my dart, I'll need my bust span measurement. The bust span measurement I'm working with is 8 inches. 8 divided by 2 gives you 4 inches. So I'm going to mark 4 inches on this point, on my chest line. I'm not adding half inch seam allowance to my bust span measurements because I'm not going to cut the back panel. But if you're cutting the back panel, you will need to add half inch seam allowance, but I'm not going to add because I'm not cutting it. So I'm going to mark 4 inches on this point, my chest point, and I'll bring it down to the seam allowance and I'll connect it. From my chest point, I'm going to come down by 1 inch. And now from my waist point, I'm going to remove 1 inch for my dart. Now I'm going to distribute that 1 inch here and here. So I'm going to mark half inch here and half inch here, which gives you 1 inch. So I'll connect this point to this point and this point to this point. I'm going to do the same thing here. So I'll bring this down. Now I'm going to find the midpoint of this line. The midpoint of this line is 4.5 inches. This is my 4.5 inches. Before I connect this point to this point, I'm going to take my bust measurement on my chest point. Now the bust circumference I'm working with is 38 inches. 38 divided by 4 gives you 9.5 inches. So this is my 9.5 inches. So I'm going to connect this point to this point with my armhole curve. Now take note, because this is the back panel, I didn't come inside by 3/4 of an inch. Now I've already taken my bust measurement here. The bust measurement I'm working with is 38 inches. 38 divided by 4 gives you 9.5 inches, which is this. I'm going to add 2 inches seam allowance. So 9.5 inches plus 2 inches gives you 11.5 inches. So I'm going to mark 11.5 inches on this line. 11.5 inches. On this point, I'm going to take my waist measurement on this point, on my waist point. The waist circumference I'm working with is 31 inches. 31 divided by 4 gives you 7 3/4. So 7 3/4 plus 7 3/4 plus this 1 inch, which I'm going to remove for this 1 inch for that, because I'm going to fold in this 1 inch, so I'll be returning this 1 inch here. 7 3/4 plus this 1 inch for that gives you 8 3/4, plus 2 inches seam allowance gives you 10 3/4. So I'm going to mark 10 3/4 here. So this is my 10 3/4. After that, on my shoulder, I'm going to add 1/2 inch seam allowance on the shoulder. If you want your back panel to have princess darts, if you want to cut your back panel as well, all you need to do is to connect this point to this point. All you need to do is to connect it this way, and you cut. But I'm not doing that. The back, I'm not cutting the back. So, but if you're going to cut yours, you will need this. So I'm going to connect this point to this point. And this point to this point. I'm going to eliminate the zipper bulge. Now this is how I'll do it. I'm going to go from the zipper allowance, I'm going to go in by 1 inch. You can decide to use 3/4 inch, you can decide to use 1/2 inch, but I like using 1 inch. So I'm going to go in by 1 inch. I'll connect this point to this point. From this point, I'm going to go in by 1 inch. So that I'll be able to create a new zipper allowance. Now I'll connect this point to this point. I'll bring it down with a straight line. Okay, so now I'm going to cut. I'm going to cut off this part. So this is my back panel. I'm going to split it. So this is the back. This is my back panel. If you found this tutorial helpful, Please like, share and subscribe to my channel to support me. Feel free to follow me on Instagram at Lizama Stitches, on Facebook at Lizama Stitches. We've come to the end of this tutorial. Thanks for watching. See you in my next video. Bye!